Settle in now. Turn down the lights, put on your headphones, and let the quiet darkness take hold. Tonight, we're going to explore something that lives in the spaces between day and night, in those hours when the world feels thin and strange. There's something about the night shift that changes people. Maybe it's the isolation, the way you become the only living soul in places that should be bustling with life. Or perhaps it's how darkness strips away the comfortable illusions we carry during daylight hours, leaving us face to face with truths we'd rather not acknowledge. Tonight, I have 5 stories for you. 5 different workers, 5 different places, but all connected by the same thread of quiet terror that weaves through the hours between midnight and dawn. Listen closely as we visit a gas station on an empty highway, walk the silent halls of a museum, tend to patients in a hospital's terminal ward, drive endless desert roads, and maintain the grounds of an ancient cemetery. Each story will show you something different about what waits in the darkness, something about the price we pay for working when the rest of the world sleeps. Story 1. The gas station attendant. Marcus had been working the overnight shift at the Crossroads gas station for 3 months when the strange customer first appeared. It was 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in February, snow falling steadily outside the fluorescent glow of the station's lights. The highway stretched empty in both directions, a ribbon of black asphalt disappearing into winter darkness. The bell above the door chimed, and Marcus looked up from his magazine to see a man in an old-fashioned coat walk inside. Nothing unusual about that, except Marcus hadn't seen any headlights pull into the lot. The man moved with deliberate steps toward the coffee machine, his footsteps oddly muffled on the linoleum floor. The customer was middle-aged, with graying hair and eyes that seemed to reflect the harsh store lighting in an unsettling way. He poured himself a cup of coffee, grabbed a pack of cigarettes from behind the counter, and approached the register. When he reached for his wallet, Marcus noticed the man's fingers were pale, almost translucent in the fluorescent light. The payment came in old bills, 20s and 10s with dates from decades past. Marcus had seen vintage currency before, usually from elderly customers who kept cash in coffee cans and mattresses. But these bills felt different, crisp and new despite their age, as if they'd been printed yesterday but dated from another era. The man paid without speaking, nodded once, and walked back toward the door. Marcus watched him go, expecting to see car lights sweep across the parking lot. Instead, he saw only the empty expanse of snow-covered asphalt, undisturbed except for the tracks his own car had made hours earlier. That's when Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. The snow outside showed no footprints leading to or from the store entrance. The pristine white surface lay unbroken, as if no one had walked across it at all. The next night, the same man appeared at exactly 3:17 a.m. Same coat, same deliberate walk to the coffee machine, same vintage bills. This time, Marcus tried to make conversation. "Cold night," he offered as the man approached the counter. The customer looked at him with those strange, reflective eyes and nodded slowly. His voice, when it came, sounded like it was traveling from a great distance. "Always cold here," the man said. "Always winter at the Crossroads." Again, no footprints in the snow. Again, no car in the parking lot. On the third night, Marcus decided to check the security cameras. The digital timestamp showed 3:17 a.m., and there he was on the monitor, standing behind the counter, apparently talking to empty air. His own voice was clearly audible on the audio feed, asking about the weather, commenting on the late hour. But there was no response, no second voice, No customer visible anywhere in the frame. Marcus watched himself hand invisible money to no one. Watched himself bag items that seemed to float in mid-air before disappearing entirely. On the recording, he looked like a man slowly losing his mind, carrying on conversations with ghosts. But Marcus remembered the customer clearly. The pale fingers, the reflective eyes, the voice that seemed to echo from somewhere far away. He remembered the texture of those old bills, the way they felt both ancient and impossibly new. The visits continued every night for 2 weeks. Always 3:17 a.m. Always the same routine. Always leaving no trace except in Marcus's increasingly fragmented memory. He started dreading that time, watching the clock creep toward the appointed hour, knowing that something impossible was about to walk through his door. It was a regular customer, old Pete, who drove truck routes through the area, who finally told Marcus the truth. Pete had stopped for coffee and noticed Marcus's haggard appearance, the way his hands shook when he counted change. "You look like you've seen a ghost, son," Pete said, and something in his tone made Marcus pay attention. "Maybe I have," Marcus replied, and found himself telling Pete about the midnight visitor. Pete's expression grew serious as he listened. When Marcus finished, the old trucker was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the intersection where the highway split in 4 directions. "That intersection's got a history," Pete said finally. "About 15 years ago, a man died in a car accident right out there. Happened during a snowstorm, around 3 a.m. Car slid on black ice, hit the guardrail, went straight into the ditch. They found him the next morning, frozen solid." Pete described the victim, and Marcus felt his heart stop. The graying hair, the old-fashioned coat, even the approximate age, it all matched his mysterious customer perfectly. "They say he was driving home from his night shift at the old factory," Pete continued. "Had a pocket full of his last paycheck, all in cash. Old bills, the kind they don't make anymore." That night, Marcus waited for 3:17 a.m. with a mixture of terror and strange anticipation. When the bell chimed and the man in the old coat walked in, Marcus saw him differently. Not as a customer, but as someone trapped in an endless loop, forever trying to complete a journey that had ended in twisted metal and broken glass 15 years ago. The man went through his usual routine, but this time, when he reached the counter, Marcus spoke first. "You don't have to keep doing this," he said gently. "The road home is closed. It's been closed for a long time." The customer looked at him with those reflective eyes, and for a moment, Marcus thought he saw something like recognition there. Something like relief. "I know," the man said, his distant voice barely above a whisper, "but I don't know how to stop." Marcus never saw him again after that night. But sometimes, when the snow falls heavy and the highway stretches empty in both directions, he thinks about the thin places where the living and the dead intersect, where night shift workers stand guard at crossroads that exist in more dimensions than we usually acknowledge. And he wonders what other lost souls might be wandering through the darkness, forever trying to find their way home. Story 2. The Museum Night Guard. Elena's footsteps echoed through the marble corridors of the Natural History Museum as she began her midnight rounds. The sound bounced off vaulted ceilings and glass display cases, creating a rhythm that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat over the past 6 months. She'd taken the night guard position after losing her day job, drawn by the solitude and the decent pay that came with working when the world slept. The museum at night was a different creature entirely from its daytime self. Without the chatter of school groups and the shuffle of tourist feet, the exhibits seemed to breathe with their own ancient life. Elena had grown comfortable with the shadows and the settling sounds of the old building, or so she told herself. It started with small things. A display case that seemed slightly askew when she passed it on her second round, though she was certain it had been perfectly aligned an hour earlier. The skeleton of a saber-toothed cat that appeared to have shifted positions, its jaw now open in what looked like a silent roar. Elena would adjust these minor discrepancies, attributing them to the building's natural expansion and contraction in the changing temperatures. But the changes became more pronounced as the weeks passed. The massive Tyrannosaurus Rex skeleton in the main hall, suspended from cables and positioned in an eternal hunting pose, began to show signs of movement that couldn't be explained by simple physics. Elena would catch glimpses of its ribcage expanding and contracting in her peripheral vision, as if the ancient bones were drawing breath after millions of years of stillness. The Native American artifacts in the cultural wing developed their own peculiar behaviors. Dream catchers would sway without any air current to move them. Pottery would hum with low, almost inaudible frequencies that seemed to resonate in Elena's chest. Ancient masks would appear to track her movement with hollow eye sockets, their painted expressions shifting between benevolent and menacing, depending on the angle of her flashlight. Elena began to document these occurrences, thinking perhaps the museum's climate control system was malfunctioning, creating air currents and vibrations that could explain the phenomena. She requested access to the security footage, hoping to find rational explanations for what she was experiencing. What she found instead shattered her understanding of the museum's nighttime reality. The security cameras showed her walking through empty corridors, alone with her flashlight and clipboard. But they also revealed something else entirely. Shadows moved independently of their sources, flowing across walls and floors like dark water seeking its own level. The exhibits themselves seemed to pulse with an energy invisible to the naked eye, but clearly captured by the digital sensors. Most disturbing of all, Elena watched herself on the footage, interacting with things that weren't there. She saw herself stepping carefully around obstacles that didn't exist, heard herself speaking to empty spaces in soothing, professional tones. On the recording, she appeared to be having conversations with the air itself, nodding and responding to unheard voices. But Elena remembered those conversations clearly. She remembered the elderly woman in Victorian dress, who often wandered the geology wing, fascinated by the mineral displays. She remembered the small boy who liked to press his face against the dinosaur exhibit glass, leaving no fingerprints but somehow fogging the surface with his breath. She remembered the Native American elder, who would sit cross-legged before the cultural displays, humming traditional songs that made the artifacts vibrate in harmony. These encounters had felt natural, comforting even. Elena had begun to think of these nighttime visitors as part of the museum's extended family, spirits drawn to the knowledge and wonder housed within these walls. She would greet them during her rounds, sometimes sharing stories about the exhibits, or simply acknowledging their presence with a respectful nod. It was during a conversation with her supervisor about updating the security protocols that Elena discovered the truth that would change everything. She mentioned the other guards who worked different wings of the museum, the ones she would occasionally glimpse during her rounds, but never quite managed to meet. Her supervisor's face went pale as Elena described these colleagues. the woman in the blue uniform who patrolled the medieval wing, the elderly man with the slight limp who covered the natural sciences section, the young guard with the kind eyes who seemed to specialize in the children's discovery area. "Elena," her supervisor said carefully, "you're the only night guard we have. You've been working alone since you started. The museum hasn't employed multiple night guards for over 2 years." The realization hit Elena like a physical blow. She wasn't interacting with visitors or colleagues. She was seeing the museum's previous guardians, souls who had become so attached to their duties that death itself couldn't relieve them of their posts. But the most chilling revelation came when Elena asked about her predecessor, the guard who had worked her shift before her. "There wasn't a predecessor," her supervisor said quietly. "We created this position specifically for you. Before that, the night wing you patrol was left unguarded. Too many incidents. Other guards refused to work that section." Elena understood then that she hadn't been hired to replace someone. She'd been hired to join them. The next night, as she walked her familiar rounds, Elena noticed other guards nodding to her from distant corridors. They no longer seemed like glimpses or shadows. They appeared solid, real, permanent fixtures of the museum's nighttime landscape. And Elena realized she couldn't remember what her apartment looked like anymore. Couldn't recall the taste of food or the feeling of sunlight on her skin. The museum had become her entire world, and she was perfectly content to let it remain that way. After all, someone had to guard the treasures. Someone had to keep watch over the ancient things that stirred in the darkness. And what better guardians than those who had chosen to stay forever, bound by duty and love for the quiet wonders that surrounded them. The museum's collection had grown by one more exhibit, though this one would never appear in any catalog. Story 3. The Hospital Night Nurse. David had always found comfort in the terminal ward's quiet rhythms during his graveyard shifts. As a night nurse at St. Catherine's Hospital, he'd learned to navigate the delicate balance between providing care and preparing families for inevitable goodbyes. The ward's hushed atmosphere suited his temperament, and he took pride in ensuring his patients' final hours were as peaceful as possible. Room 237 had been empty for a week since Mrs. Henderson passed away. David remembered her clearly, a gentle woman in her 70s who'd spent her last days asking about her garden and worrying about her cat. He'd been with her when she died, holding her hand as her breathing grew shallow and finally stopped. The room had been thoroughly cleaned and prepared for the next patient, but the bed remained empty, waiting. It was during his 2 a.m. medication rounds that David first noticed the figure in room 237. Through the doorway, he glimpsed someone sitting upright in the bed that should have been vacant. The sight was so natural, so expected, that David simply continued his routine. He knocked gently on the doorframe and entered with his usual professional smile. Mrs. Henderson looked exactly as she had during her final days, wearing the same faded blue hospital gown, her silver hair neatly combed despite the late hour. She turned toward David with the same kind eyes he remembered, though something about her gaze seemed to carry depths that hadn't been there before. "Good evening, Mrs. Henderson," David said, checking the chart that materialized in his hands. "How are you feeling tonight?" "Much better, dear," she replied, her voice carrying that familiar warmth tinged with something distant. "Though I'm worried about Mr. Patterson in 241. His time is coming sooner than the doctors think." David nodded, making a mental note to check on Mr. Patterson. Mrs. Henderson had always been perceptive about the other patients, often sensing changes in their conditions before the medical staff noticed. He took her vitals, recorded her responses, and ensured she was comfortable before moving on to his other patients. It wasn't until he reached the nurse's station that the impossibility of the situation struck him. David pulled Mrs. Henderson's file, confirming what he already knew. She had died 7 days ago. Her body had been released to the funeral home. The memorial service had been held 3 days past. Yet the chart in his hands showed current vital signs, medication schedules, and care notes in his own handwriting. David stared at the documents, trying to reconcile the physical evidence with his rational understanding of death and hospital protocols. He returned to room 237, expecting to find it empty. Instead, Mrs. Henderson was still there, now standing by the window and gazing out at the parking lot below. "The night shift is the hardest," she said without turning around. "That's when the veil grows thin, when we can see what's really happening." "What do you mean?" David asked, though part of him already understood. "You've been following the schedule, haven't you, dear? Making your rounds, providing comfort, easing the transitions. But have you looked at who's really making those decisions?" David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. He thought about his recent patients, the ones whose conditions had deteriorated exactly when Mrs. Henderson had predicted. Mr. Patterson, who would likely pass within the next few hours. Mrs. Chen in 239, who had maybe 2 days left. The young man in 243, whose family didn't yet know how little time remained. "How do you know?" he whispered. Mrs. Henderson turned from the window, and David saw that her eyes now held the infinite sadness of someone who understood too much. "Because I've been watching you work, David. Night after night, month after month. You think you're providing care, but you're really serving as death's gentle hand. You make the transitions easier, help souls find their way to whatever comes next." David's mind raced through his career, remembering all the patients he'd comforted in their final moments, the families he'd consoled, the hands he'd held, the peaceful deaths he'd facilitated. He'd always believed he was saving lives, extending comfort, providing professional medical care. "The schedule you follow," Mrs. Henderson continued, "it's not written by the doctors or the hospital administration. You've been reading death's own appointments, helping souls cross over when their time arrives. Every night you walk these halls as a guardian of the threshold between life and whatever lies beyond." David looked down at his hands, seeing them as if for the first time. How many foreheads had he touched in blessing? How many final breaths had he witnessed? How many times had he known, with inexplicable certainty, that a patient's time had come? "But why can I see you?" he asked. Mrs. Henderson smiled with infinite compassion. "Because you're one of us now, dear. You've been serving this purpose for so long that the boundary between life and death has become meaningless for you. You exist in both worlds, helping others make the journey you've already begun." As understanding dawned, David felt not fear, but profound peace. His work had meaning beyond anything he'd imagined. He wasn't just a night nurse. He was a shepherd of souls, guiding the dying toward whatever awaited them in the darkness beyond the hospital walls. The terminal ward would always need guardians like him, Story 4. The Long-Haul Trucker. Sarah's 18-wheeler cut through the pre-dawn darkness of Interstate 40, her headlights carving a narrow tunnel of visibility through the endless desert landscape. She'd been driving this route for 12 years, hauling freight between Phoenix and Albuquerque, and knew every mile marker, every rest stop, every subtle curve in the asphalt. The night shift paid better, and Sarah had always preferred the solitude of empty highways to the chaos of daytime traffic. Her CB radio crackled with the usual chatter of other night drivers, voices floating across the airwaves like electronic ghosts, sharing the loneliness of the road. Sarah half listened to the familiar banter about weather conditions, speed traps, and the best coffee at upcoming truck stops. It was comforting background noise that made the vast emptiness feel less isolating. But lately, the conversations had taken on a strange quality that made Sarah adjust her radio, thinking the signal was picking up old recordings or distant stations bleeding through atmospheric interference. Breaker 19, this is Moondog heading eastbound, came a voice through the static. Anyone know if that Sinclair station at mile marker 247 is still serving hot food? Haven't eaten since Flagstaff. Sarah knew that voice, though she couldn't place it immediately. More troubling was the reference to the Sinclair station. That truck stop had been demolished 15 years ago, replaced by a modern travel center with different branding entirely. Copy that, Moondog, another voice responded. Food's good there, but watch out for that pothole coming up on the westbound side. Nearly took out my front axle last week. Sarah checked her mirrors and saw only empty highway stretching behind her. No other trucks, no headlights, nothing but the pale glow of her own taillights reflected in the darkness. Yet the CB chatter continued. Drivers discussing road conditions, sharing information about routes and stops that existed only in memory. As the nights passed, Sarah began to recognize the voices. Moondog was Charlie Morrison, a driver who'd worked this route in the 90s before dying in a jackknife accident near Gallup. The woman calling herself Desert Rose was Linda Vasquez, who'd suffered a heart attack at the wheel and crashed into a median barrier 8 years ago. One by one, Sarah identified the phantom drivers, all of them people who died on this stretch of highway, their voices somehow still broadcasting across frequencies that shouldn't exist. The phenomenon escalated when Sarah began seeing trucks in her mirrors that vanished when she turned to look directly. Ghostly rigs would appear in her peripheral vision, matching her speed exactly, their running lights creating constellations in the darkness. She'd catch glimpses of familiar paint jobs and company logos from trucking firms that had gone out of business decades ago. At the Meteor Crater rest stop, Sarah encountered them face to face for the first time. She pulled in for her mandatory break, expecting the usual collection of late-night travelers and fellow drivers grabbing coffee and stretching their legs. Instead, she found the parking area filled with trucks from different eras, their chrome bumpers and custom paint jobs gleaming under the sodium lights. The drivers gathered around picnic tables looked solid and real, sharing stories and coffee just like any normal night. But Sarah recognized them all from newspaper clippings and memorial services she'd attended over the years. Charlie Morrison tipped his baseball cap in greeting. Linda Vasquez waved from behind the wheel of her restored Peterbilt. A dozen other drivers she'd known, all of them dead, all of them continuing their routes through some impossible extension of the highway system. Sarah, Charlie called out, his voice carrying the same warmth she remembered from their CB conversations years ago. Good to see you're still running this route. How's the road treating you? I don't understand, Sarah said, approaching the group with cautious steps. You all died. I went to some of your funerals." Linda smiled with infinite sadness. "Death's just another mile marker, honey. Some of us aren't ready to park our rigs permanently. This highway's been our life for so long, it's hard to imagine existing anywhere else." As understanding crept over Sarah, she realized the truth she'd been avoiding. The accident 3 months ago, the one where she'd swerved to avoid a deer and rolled her truck down an embankment. She remembered the impact, the twisted metal, the long darkness that followed. "We've been waiting for you to join the convoy," Charlie said gently. "You belong here with us, running the eternal route." Sarah looked at her hands, seeing through them to the pavement below. Her truck, when she turned to look, bore the damage from that fatal crash, its cab crushed but somehow still operational. The highway stretched endlessly in both directions, and Sarah understood that some journeys never truly end. Some drivers become so connected to the road that even death can't force them to pull over permanently. She climbed back into her phantom cab, fired up the engine, and pulled onto the interstate to continue her route through the darkness, her voice joining the eternal chatter of drivers who'd chosen the highway as their forever home. Story 5. The Graveyard Groundskeeper. Thomas had maintained the grounds of Willowbrook Cemetery for 37 years, most of them working the midnight shift when the world grew quiet and the dead could rest undisturbed. He preferred the solitude of night work, finding peace in the rhythmic tasks of trimming grass around weathered headstones and ensuring the pathways remained clear for morning visitors. The cemetery after dark held a different kind of beauty, moonlight casting long shadows between ancient oaks and marble monuments. His routine was precise and comforting. Check the gates, walk the perimeter, tend to any maintenance issues, and ensure the grounds remained dignified and serene. Thomas took pride in his work, viewing himself as a caretaker not just of the landscape, but of the memories housed within these sacred acres. It began with subtle signs that disrupted his familiar patterns. Fresh earth beside graves that hadn't seen burials in decades. Rectangular patches of disturbed soil perfectly shaped like grave plots, complete with the telltale mounds of recent digging. Thomas would arrive at these sites expecting to find work orders or burial permits, but his records showed no scheduled interments. The groundskeeping shed held no evidence of recent digging. His tools remained exactly where he'd left them, clean and properly stored. Yet the graves continued to show signs of fresh excavation, as if invisible hands were preparing plots for arrivals that existed only in some parallel schedule. Thomas began documenting these occurrences, photographing the disturbed earth, and checking with the cemetery office during his brief overlap with day staff. The administrators assured him no unauthorized digging was taking place. No permits had been issued for the affected areas. They suggested perhaps animals were responsible, though the precision of the excavations made such explanations seem unlikely. The phenomenon escalated when Thomas began encountering mourners during his midnight rounds. They appeared as solid and real as any daytime visitors, standing beside graves with flowers in hand, or kneeling in prayer beside headstones. At first, Thomas assumed they were family members who'd received special permission for after-hours visits, perhaps shift workers who couldn't come during regular hours. He would approach these visitors with respectful discretion, ensuring they felt comfortable, while gently reminding them of cemetery policies. The mourners were always polite, thanking him for his consideration, and explaining they'd come to visit recently departed loved ones. But when Thomas checked the graves they visited, he found headstones bearing dates that hadn't yet arrived. Death dates months or even years in the future. carved into marble with the same weathered precision as the older monuments. Names of people he recognized from the local community, individuals who were still alive and going about their daily lives in town. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell knelt beside a grave marked with her own name, the death date showing next autumn. She placed fresh daisies in the granite vase and spoke quietly to the headstone about her garden and her grandchildren's recent visit. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" she said to Thomas as he passed. "I always loved this time of night. So peaceful." Thomas nodded, unsure how to respond to a woman mourning her own future death. When he checked the cemetery records the next day, he found no plot reserved for Eleanor Hartwell, no pre-need arrangements in her name. As these encounters multiplied, Thomas began to understand that Willowbrook Cemetery existed in more than one timeline. The grounds he maintained served not only the already dead, but those whose deaths were approaching. A way station where souls could begin their transition before their physical bodies caught up to their spiritual destiny. The fresh graves he'd been finding weren't unauthorized digging. They were preparations for arrivals that existed in tomorrow's schedule. Plots being readied by forces that understood time differently than the living world. Thomas realized he'd been serving as groundskeeper for multiple versions of the cemetery simultaneously. His midnight maintenance preserved the dignity of the past while preparing sacred space for futures that were already written in stone. The revelation came when Thomas found his own name on a headstone in the oldest section of the cemetery, the death date showing 40 years in the past. He understood then that he'd been dead longer than any of the souls he'd been helping to transition. His dedication to the grounds had bound him to Willowbrook so completely that death itself couldn't relieve him of his duties. Standing in the moonlight beside his own grave, Thomas felt profound contentment rather than fear. He'd found his eternal purpose as guardian of the threshold between life and death, maintaining sacred ground where time folded in on itself, and every soul could find the peace they needed for whatever came next. The cemetery would always need a groundskeeper who understood that some responsibilities transcend the boundaries between worlds. That's it for tonight. Consider leaving a like and subscribing. See you in the next quiet hour.